The Xiphorian race was in trouble. Their once thriving planet Zifra was now under attack by an enemy they had never encountered before. The attackers were swift, merciless, and brutal, striking with unimaginable force. The Xiphorians had tried to defend themselves, but their technology was outdated, their military too small, and their will, though strong, could not overcome the relentless assault. In the midst of this chaos, the Xiphorians knew that they needed help urgently. Their last hope was to reach out across the stars, to call upon anyone who might offer assistance, anyone who could save their world from certain destruction. Desperation gripped their hearts, and the leaders of Zifra made the difficult decision to send a distress signal into the void of space, hoping for a miracle. The message they sent was simple, but urgent. Please help us. We are under attack. Our world is dying. We need assistance. We need your strength. Please, come quickly. It was broadcasted across all frequencies, directed to any race or civilization who might hear it. The Xiphorians had no idea who might respond, only that they had no other option but to rely on the kindness or strength of others. Back on Xiphora, the situation grew worse by the hour. Cities burned, people fled into hiding, and the military defenses were being quickly overwhelmed. Every minute felt like a lifetime. There was no time left for second chances. As the message went out, a small group of leaders gathered in a war room, watching the stars for any sign of hope. They knew that whoever responded to the distress signal would shape the future of their race. For days, there was silence. The only sounds were the cries of the fallen and the distant rumble of the battles that raged across the planet. The leaders of Zifra sat in despair, wondering if anyone would ever come. Had they made a mistake? Was their message too late? Or perhaps there was no one out there willing to help. Then, just as the hope was beginning to fade, something unexpected happened. A signal came through, faint at first, but growing clearer by the second. The Xiphorians rushed to intercept it. This was it, the help they had prayed for. It was a response, finally. But as the signal cleared and the message was decoded, confusion began to set in. The response wasn't from any ally they had ever known. It wasn't from the peaceful Galactic Federation they had been part of, nor from any of the races they had once called friends. Instead, the message was from a fleet, one that carried an unsettling energy, a fleet unlike anything the Xiphorians had ever seen before. The message simply read, "We are coming." The Xiphorians sat in stunned silence. There was no mention of assistance, no mention of aid, just the cold promise of a fleet arriving. They could hardly believe it. Who were these people, and why had they responded? And most troubling of all, were they friends or enemies? As the fleet's approach became known, fear began to grip the hearts of the Xiphorians. They had called for help, but was this really the answer they had hoped for? What kind of help would come from a fleet that didn't identify itself, that didn't promise aid, but simply stated that they were coming? The leaders of Zifra held an emergency meeting. The atmosphere was tense, with every officer and scientist trying to make sense of this strange, unexpected turn of events. Some feared the worst, that the fleet was an invading force, taking advantage of the Xiphorians' weakened state. Others wondered if it was a mercenary fleet, here to take advantage of the chaos and claim their planet's riches. But one thing was certain, this was no ordinary help. The Xiphorians would soon find out that their desperate call for help had brought something far more terrifying than they ever could have imagined. As the fleet neared, the sky above Zifra darkened. The ships were massive, their silhouettes casting ominous shadows over the planet's surface. This was not the salvation the Xiphorians had been hoping for. This was something much darker, much more dangerous. The fleet had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Xiphorians watched in disbelief as the fleet drew closer. The ships were unlike anything they had ever seen, huge, ominous, and powerful. There was no elegance in their design, no peaceful aura about them. Instead, the ships seemed to exude an aura of raw, terrifying power. They were massive, with jagged edges and weapons that looked more like instruments of destruction than anything else. The approach was slow but deliberate, as if the fleet was taking its time to savor the arrival. On the ground, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The leaders of Zifra had never expected this. The hope they had clung to, the desperate wish for help, now felt like a cruel joke. The message they had received, a simple statement of "we are coming," had now become an ominous reality. The fleet was no longer a distant hope. It was an undeniable presence in their skies, and its intentions were still unclear. As the fleet came into full view, a ripple of anxiety spread through the Xiphorian ranks. The Xiphorians had long relied on their allies for protection, but this was different. No one knew who these strangers were or why they had chosen to respond to their distress signal. Were they here to save them, or were they here to finish what their enemies had started? Terror and confusion gripped the people as the first ships in the fleet descended into the atmosphere. The sheer size of the craft was enough to make the Xiphorians feel small and powerless. Their defenses, already stretched thin from the previous attacks, stood no chance against these colossal warships. They had never encountered anything like this before. It felt as though the very sky was closing in on them. In the command center, the leaders tried to make sense of the situation. Communications were coming in from all over the planet, reports of the fleet's movements flooding the channels. Every one of them was filled with unease, with questions no one could answer. Who were these people? What did they want? And most importantly, what would happen once they arrived? As the fleet drew closer, a strange signal emanated from one of the larger ships. It wasn't a message, but a strange hum, almost like a warning. The air seemed to vibrate with the sound, and every Xiphorian felt it deep in their bones. Something was coming, something far beyond their understanding. The military leaders quickly tried to organize a response. They had no idea who these newcomers were, but they couldn't afford to do nothing. Their planet was already under siege, and if this fleet was hostile, they would need to prepare for the worst. But no matter how much they tried to ready themselves, a feeling of helplessness hung in the air. They couldn't match the might of this fleet. They could only wait, watching as the massive ships loomed ever closer. Then, without warning, a single ship detached from the fleet and made its way down to the surface. It was enormous, dwarfing the Xiphorian capital as it descended. The ship's silhouette cast a shadow over the city, making everything beneath it seem insignificant. The Xiphorians could do nothing but watch in stunned silence as the ship touched down. As the dust settled and the ship's hatch slowly opened, a figure emerged. The leader of this fleet, a towering figure draped in dark armor, stepped onto the surface of His presence was overwhelming, and as he surveyed the landscape, the Xiphorians held their breath. There was no joy in his eyes, no compassion. Instead, there was only cold determination and a sense of unyielding power. In that moment it became painfully clear to the Xiphorians, this was not the rescue they had hoped for. This was not an ally coming to save them. No, the fleet had come with a different purpose. They had come to claim what was theirs. As the figure walked toward the gathered leaders, the Xiphorians knew that their world, their future, had just taken a dark turn. The help they had begged for was not what they had imagined. It wasn't salvation. It was something far worse. And now, they were at the mercy of the Deathwelder fleet. The figure who stepped from the massive ship was not like any Xiphorian they had ever seen. His armor gleamed in the dim light of the shattered sky, dark and polished, with sharp angles that seemed to cut through the very air. His height was imposing, a towering presence that made the Xiphorians feel as though they were standing before an unstoppable force. His movements were slow, deliberate, each step sending a ripple of tension through the air. He was not here to negotiate, to converse, or to offer any hope of rescue. He was here to dominate. The Xiphorian leader stood frozen in place, unable to move as the figure advanced. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the group with a sense of detachment, as if they were nothing more than insects beneath his gaze. The air between them was thick with silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the city still burning in the background. The rest of the fleet loomed overhead, their ships hovering in the sky like dark clouds waiting to unleash their fury. The leader finally spoke, his voice low and resonant, carrying an authority that made the very ground beneath their feet seem to tremble. "I am Commander Trent," he said, his tone cold and direct. "We are here to collect what is ours." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and the Xiphorians struggled to comprehend what he meant. Collect what is ours. The plea for help they had sent out, the desperate call for aid, had it all been a trap? Had they unknowingly given away something of value, something that now justified this brutal response? The leader of the Xiphorians, General Vorkuth, took a tentative step forward. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his voice steady as he spoke. You are here to help us?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Commander Trent's lips curled into a slight, cruel smile. "Help," he echoed, as if the word itself was beneath him. "No, you called for aid, but we are not here to save you. You called for help, and now you will pay the price for it." Vorkuth's mind raced. What did this mean? What was he talking about? Had their world been sold off to the death? The implications were terrifying, but Vorkuth could feel the weight of reality settling in. These people, these beings, were not here to rescue them. They were here to claim Xiphora for themselves. As the realization sank in, the Xiphorians scrambled to react, but their attempts to mobilize their forces were futile. The Deathwelder fleet had already made their move. Without warning, they began to deploy their ground forces, massive armored units that poured from the ships like a storm. quickly surrounding the city and establishing dominance. The Zyphorians were overwhelmed. They had no idea what to do, no way to fight back. The Death Wielders were simply too powerful. They were ruthless, and their presence seemed to choke the very life out of the planet. The once proud city now stood in complete silence, the inhabitants caught between fear and disbelief. Commander Trent stood silently, watching the chaos unfold. There was no need for further action on his part. His fleet had already done its job. The Zyphorians were at his mercy, and he knew it. The price they had paid for asking for help was far higher than they could ever have imagined. With a sharp gesture, he signaled to his forces, and they moved in to seize control. The once peaceful world of Zifra was now a battlefield, its people caught between their past mistakes and the brutal reality of their present. As the Zyphorians watched helplessly, Commander Trent's fleet tightened its grip on the planet. There was no turning back now. The Death Wielders had come, and they would not leave until they had taken everything they wanted. The Zyphorians were left with a terrible question. How had it all gone so wrong? They had called for help, but they had unknowingly summoned their doom, and now, their world would never be the same again. The air on Zifra felt heavier now, thick with tension and uncertainty. Commander Trent stood in the heart of the city, his presence towering over everything, while his forces took complete control. The once vibrant streets of the capital were now lined with Death Wielder soldiers, their cold eyes scanning every corner, ensuring no one could escape. The Zyphorians' resistance, if it could even be called that, was already fading. They had been too shocked, too overwhelmed to put up a meaningful fight. The Death Wielders had arrived, and they were here to claim, not to help. General Vorkuth watched helplessly from his command post, knowing there was nothing left to do. His planet, his people, were now at the mercy of these merciless invaders. He had tried to prepare, tried to organize some form of resistance, but it was clear now that nothing would stop the Death. They were too strong, too relentless. Zifra had no chance. As he sat in the dimly lit room, the walls now shaking with the faint vibrations of the massive ships still hovering above, Vorkuth's mind raced. The words Commander Trent had spoken echoed in his ears. You called for aid, and now you will pay the price for it. What did that mean? Had they unknowingly entered into some kind of agreement with these humans? What had they promised and what would they now demand in return? He couldn't help but think back to the beginning when the Zyphorians had sent their distress call, praying for help. The situation had been dire. Their enemies, the Korans, had attacked without mercy, overwhelming their defenses, leaving them no choice but to plead for assistance. They had hoped for salvation, for allies to come and drive the invaders away, but now, this was their reality. They had called for help, and in return they had summoned an invader far worse than their enemies. They had brought this destruction upon themselves. Vorkuth's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden communication. A face appeared on the screen, one of the Zyphorian commanders who had been stationed in the eastern part of the city. His voice crackled through the speaker, panic and disbelief evident in his tone. General, you need to see this. The fleet, they're not just here to occupy. They're harvesting the resources. The entire planet. They've already begun. Vorkuth's heart sank. What did that mean? The Death Wielders weren't here just to conquer. They were taking everything. All the natural resources, all the wealth of Zifra. They were stripping the planet bare. It wasn't just a military occupation. It was a full-scale extraction. They were not only claiming Zifra as their own, but they were also going to drain it of everything that made it valuable. It was a death sentence for the Zyphorian people. What do you mean, harvesting? Vorkuth demanded, his voice shaking. What are they doing? They're using massive machines, tearing apart the planet's core, the commander explained. Every resource is being stripped away. The rivers, the forests, they're taking everything. It's like they're preparing to abandon the planet once they've drained it dry. Vorkuth felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This was not just an invasion. This was a massacre on a planetary scale. The Death Wielders were not here to save them. They were here to consume them, to take everything of value and leave the planet a hollow shell of what it once was. That's Vorkuth processed this new reality. He realized there was no escaping it. There was no more hope. The Zyphorians had made their final, fatal mistake. The Death Wielders had come, and they were not leaving until there was nothing left to take. The general stood up from his chair, his gaze fixed on the chaotic scene outside the window. His people were doomed, and the weight of their fate crushed down on him like 1,000 tons. There was no fight left in them, no way to turn the tide. All that was left was to watch as the Death Wielders drained Zifra of everything it was, and as the last of the Zyphorian resistance crumbled, beneath the unyielding force of the Death Wielder fleet, Vorkuth understood the terrible truth. This was the price of their desperation. This was the price of their call for help. and it was a price no one, not even the Deathworlders, would ever forget. The sounds of destruction echoed throughout Zifra, and the once thriving cities were now silent witnesses to the brutality unfolding. Commander Trent had made it clear there would be no negotiation, no mercy. The Deathworlders were not here to conquer in the traditional sense. They were here to strip Zifra of everything that made it valuable, leaving nothing but ashes and empty spaces. The Zyphorians, beaten and broken, were forced into submission. Their planet, their home, was no longer under their control. The streets were filled with the remnants of what had once been a proud civilization. Buildings crumbled to dust. Rivers polluted with chemicals, forests razed to the ground. Everywhere one looked, there was evidence of the Deathworlders' unyielding greed, but even in the face of this overwhelming force, there was something stirring within the Zyphorians, something that had been buried deep within their hearts for years, something that had always been a part of them. Hope, a flicker of resistance that would not be easily extinguished on the heart of the ruined capital. A small group of Zyphorian rebels had gathered. They were not the most powerful, nor the most skilled, but they were driven by a fierce determination. The Deathworlders had taken their planet, but they had not taken their will to fight. Among them was General Vorkuth, who, despite the weight of failure that crushed his shoulders, had not yet given up. He stood in front of the rebel group, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and defiance. "We have lost everything," he said, his voice steady despite the deep exhaustion in his bones. "But we cannot allow them to take everything, not without a fight." The rebels nodded, their faces hardened by the reality of what had happened, but still fueled by a spark of defiance. They were the last hope, the final line of resistance. Vorkuth knew that their chances of success were slim, but he also knew that if they didn't act now, Zifra would be lost forever. For hours they plotted and prepared, gathering what little they had left, scraps of weapons, old communication devices, and stolen intel. They knew the Deathworlders' strength, but they also knew their weakness. The Deathworlders may have been unbeatable on the battlefield, but they were not invincible. Their greed, their desire to take everything, had left gaps. There were places where their forces were stretched thin. There were opportunities, however small, to strike back. As night fell, the rebels moved swiftly through the shadows. They knew that the Deathworlders had been careless in their pursuit of resources. They had underestimated the Zyphorians, believing that their conquest was inevitable, but Vorkuth and his band of rebels were determined to prove them wrong. The plan was risky, perhaps even suicidal, but it was their only chance. They would infiltrate the heart of the Deathworlder operations, disrupt their extraction processes, and strike at the core of their power. The rebels moved with precision, sneaking past the heavily guarded checkpoints and into the heart of the Deathworlder encampment. As they entered the massive extraction facility, Vorkuth's heart raced. The machines that had been tearing Zifra apart were now in full swing, their monstrous gears grinding away at the planet's core. Every turn, every step, took them closer to their goal and to their potential doom. Despite the odds, the rebels fought with a newfound strength. They sabotaged power lines, planted explosives, and tore apart the extraction equipment. The Deathworlders had underestimated their resolve, and as the explosions rang out, the rebels knew they had made their mark. But even in their victory, they were acutely aware of the larger truth. They had only delayed the inevitable. The Deathworlders would return. They would always return. And while this small victory might ignite a spark of hope in the hearts of the Zyphorians, it would never be enough to turn the tide of the war. Still, for the first time in days, the Zyphorians felt something they hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of control. The Deathworlders might have taken their world, but they had not yet taken their spirit, and that, at least, was something worth fighting for. The rebellion was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The Zyphorians now knew the true cost of their desperation, but they also knew that sometimes, the only way to reclaim what had been lost was to fight even when the odds seemed impossible. The Zyphorians' brief victory, though small, ignited something they had not felt in months. As the rebels vanished into the shadows after their sabotage, they left behind a ripple of defiance that reverberated across the planet. For the first time, the Deathworlders had been caught off guard, and the Zyphorians realized that there was still some fight left in them. But it was only a momentary spark in an otherwise darkened sky. The war was far from over, and the Deathworlder fleet was relentless in its pursuit of complete domination. In the days that followed, the Zyphorian resistance, though scattered and under-equipped, began to grow in strength. The news of the rebellion spread like wildfire, reaching even the most distant corners of Zifra. The people, once crushed by despair, began to gather together once more. A new force began to form, one that would stand against the invaders no matter the cost. General Vorkuth, now recognized as the symbol of their resistance, was both the leader and the heart of this emerging rebellion. Despite the odds stacked against them, he never wavered. His eyes, though weary, burned with the unshakable conviction that they could still save their world. But as the Deathworlders continued to tighten their grip on the rebellion's true test was just beginning. Commander Trent, watching from his command ship in orbit, knew that this was no longer just a conquest. The Xiphorians were more than just a conquered species now. They were a challenge to be destroyed, an obstacle to be erased. The Deathworlders had underestimated the power of their enemy's spirit, and now, as they learned of the growing resistance, they began to take harsher actions. In retaliation for the sabotage, the Deathworlders unleashed a devastating wave of attacks on the cities still standing. They burned fields, destroyed monuments, and leveled entire cities. Zephyros landscape, once vibrant and alive, was rapidly becoming a barren wasteland, a testament to the ruthless nature of their invaders. But with each blow, the spirit of the Xiphorian people only seemed to grow stronger. The survivors gathered once more in secret, forming alliances with any who would join their cause. The rebellion's strength was still a fraction of the Deathworlder force, but it was becoming increasingly clear that their unity was their greatest weapon. Vorkuth and his commanders strategized tirelessly, learning from each skirmish, improving their tactics, and adapting to the methods of their new, terrifying enemy. They couldn't match the sheer firepower of the Deathworlder fleet, but they could outsmart them, and they could fight smarter, not harder. One evening, after yet another brutal bombardment from the Deathworlders, Vorkuth stood on a hill overlooking the charred remains of a once thriving city. The ruins glowed under the dim light of the setting sun, a symbol of their ongoing struggle. As he looked out over the wreckage, the weight of the loss pressed heavily on his chest, but something else burned in his heart: determination. "We can still turn this around," he muttered to himself, a vow to the fallen and a promise to the living. The Xiphorians had fought before, and they would fight again. Their planet, their culture, their very existence was worth defending. As long as a single breath remained in their bodies, they would not give up. The Deathworlders might have come to claim everything Zifra had, but they had underestimated the resolve of its people. The rebellion would not end until the Deathworlders were driven from their land. It was no longer just about survival, it was about reclaiming their world, their future. And as Vorkuth gathered his forces for the next battle, one thing became painfully clear. No matter how powerful the Deathworlders were, they could never destroy the spirit of the That was something they could never take. The war was far from over, but the rebels now had something they had never had before: an unbreakable will. And with that, the fight would continue, as the heart of Zyphra beat on, stronger than ever before. The days blurred together as the Xiphorian resistance grew more desperate, but also more determined. Zyphra, once a vibrant world, had become a battleground. Every inch of land had been scarred by the relentless force of the Deathworlder fleet, and yet the Xiphorians held on. They had lost so much already: homes, cities, loved ones, but the spirit of resistance had never been stronger. Commander Trent's forces were vast, but there was something the Deathworlders could not comprehend, something they had underestimated: the Xiphorian resolve. The rebellion, though fragmented and under-equipped, had begun to organize. What was once a scattered effort now took shape as a unified force. General Vorkuth, once the symbol of their doom, was now the beacon of hope. His speeches rallied the people, igniting a fire within their hearts that had long been dormant. They had nothing left to lose, and that made them more dangerous than any invader. The rebels, scattered across the planet, had formed small but well-coordinated cells that worked in the shadows, sabotaging Deathworlder supply lines and ambushing their patrols. The Deathworlders had expected an easy conquest, but instead, they were now facing an enemy that would not bow. The Xiphorians, pushed to the brink, had become experts at guerrilla warfare. Their tactics were far from conventional, but that was what made them so unpredictable. With every successful strike, the Deathworlder forces grew more frustrated, more reckless. Commander Trent, having watched the initial stages of the Xiphorian resistance, had begun to realize something he hadn't expected. These creatures were more resilient than he had given them credit for. The fleet had underestimated the will of a people fighting for their survival. The Deathworlders had arrived with the intent of erasing Zephora from existence, but now they found themselves struggling to maintain control. The more the Xiphorians fought back, the more it became clear that this was no ordinary invasion. The Deathworlders were being pushed to their limits. Vorkuth, despite the exhaustion that weighed him down, stood tall. He knew the moment of reckoning was coming. The Deathworlder fleet had grown overconfident, and their arrogance had begun to show. The Xiphorians now had the upper hand in strategy, knowing their land, their people, and their weaknesses better than any invader could. Vorkuth gathered his most trusted commanders. They had a plan, an audacious one that could change the course of the war. They would launch a direct assault on the Deathwelder flagship, the very heart of the fleet, where Commander Trent himself resided. The plan was risky, with no guarantee of success, but Vorkuth's voice carried the weight of their struggle. If we can strike at the heart, we can disrupt their control. We can show them that Zifra is not theirs to take. We will make them feel the cost of their invasion. Under the cover of darkness, the rebels gathered in their final formation. They would move quickly, with the element of surprise on their side. It was their only chance to truly strike fear into the death. The rebellion's heart beat in their chest, pumping adrenaline through their veins. This was the moment they had been fighting for, the opportunity to reclaim their world from the brink of annihilation. As they infiltrated the Deathwelder flagship's defenses, they found themselves in a battle not just for survival, but for the very future of their species. The Zephyrians, their backs against the wall, fought with a ferocity that even the Deathwelders could not anticipate. Every shot, every explosion, every calculated move was a testament to the unyielding spirit of the Zephyrian people. The flagship was heavily fortified, but the rebels pushed forward, inch by inch. As the battle raged, Vorkuth found himself face to face with Commander Trent. Their eyes met across the wreckage, and for the first time, the Deathwelder commander saw the true weight of the Zephyrian spirit. With a final, fierce cry, the rebels reached the heart of the flagship. The Deathwelder fleet's communication systems were destroyed, and for the first time since the invasion began, the Deathwelders were thrown into chaos. It wasn't a decisive victory, but it was a victory nonetheless, a statement to the invaders that the Zephyrians would never yield. As the dust settled, the rebellion knew that their battle was far from over. The Deathwelders would return, stronger and more ruthless than ever before. But in that moment, the Zephyrians had shown the universe that they were not easily defeated. Zephyra was still their home, and they would fight for it, no matter the cost. The war had only just begun, but one thing was clear: the Zephyrians would never give up. They had learned that no matter how dark the skies, there was always a chance to strike back, to reclaim what was lost. And with each victory, however small, they grew closer to turning the tide.